Hello, and welcome to another of our Lucinity webinars. My name is Luke Fairweather, VP of Sales with Lucinity, and I'm delighted to be joined today by Alex Ridden, founder and CEO of our friends and partners at Knights Analytics. Alex, thanks so much for joining.
Hey, thanks, Luke. Really nice to be here.
Likewise, if only because it's sunny today. So today, I think we're talking about something that is pretty integral to the modern world of financial crime investigation, and it's something, of course, that you are expert in. That being entity resolution and playing with structured and unstructured data. But before we do that, maybe you could just give a brief intro to yourself, who you are, how you came to found Knights, and what excites you.
Yeah, sure. So, well, I'm Alex Ridden, and I'm the CEO of a startup called Knights Analytics. We basically specialize in matching and merging information about hopefully real world things, but sometimes also conceptual things. My background started in the financial crime detection domain. I started my career, I guess, just over a decade ago, working on kind of everything about deployment of software for all kinds of interesting use cases. So my very first project, I was looking for insider traders inside a trading bank. But then I quickly moved into more investigative use cases like insurance fraud and organized crime in anti-money laundering. But my background's more technical. So I started out very much implementing systems. So it could have been anything from getting the databases set up through to fine-tuning entity resolution systems and ultimately building models to detect whatever it was we were looking for. I think that was really formative for the rest of my career, really. I spent the rest of my career as a machine learning engineer and data scientist, where I would be building, again, models which were to go into production to find normally these similar use cases. But I also spent a bunch of time doing completely different things outside of the financial crime domain. So I helped build a wine recommendation system and financial forecasting and all kinds of other fun projects. But ultimately, I kept coming back to this original, I guess, obsession with entity resolution. I would say the reason why I think it's so critical in the use cases that you're focused on at Lucinity is that I realized quite quickly in my first job that I didn't think the models we were building were necessarily better than our competitors' models. I don't think we were doing anything super unique, but what we were doing much better than them was preparing the data. So we were cleaning and connecting the data in a way that created a lot more context, which could then be leveraged by those models. And I think many people will tell you who work directly with data that it's only as good as what you can feed it. And so if you can...
This is the GIGO principle, or as in the slightly less PG expression, I've heard it referred to, CISO, right?
Right. Yes. And that was also like humbling for me, right? Where it was like, it doesn't matter how hard I work on this model, if I don't get that data layer right, if I can't use information that someone else has managed to figure out how to integrate, I'm probably not going to find the things that they can find. And so as I then progressed throughout the rest of my career, I kept kind of making sure I paid a lot of attention to being able to connect data together, clean data and merge it. And it was one project in particular that led me to think, hey, I think there's, a real product here just in the entity resolution layer. And especially when we're looking at extracting information from like documents and text where maybe the traditional systems weren't working for me. So yeah, that's the long and short of kind of who I am, and also the start of Knights Analytics.
That's really interesting. I think there's plenty that we can dig into right out of the gate, up to and including whether or not you've got any recommendations for a good Merlot for a 2-year-old, which is top of mind for me right now. But I guess the immediate thing that I kind of caught my attention was that that insider trading thing that you called right out of the gate. If I half-out story as well, right? So that's actually where kind of GK started using voice communication, listening out for, signs of bragging and things like this, which again is almost sort of by definition unstructured data because it's human speech, right? So maybe we could start there, and then sort of what informed the rest of that journey, and maybe I'll wrap up that 3-part implicit question with, for the uninformed or the uninitiated, what is entity resolution?
Yeah. No, that's great. Maybe we could start there, actually, because it's a good start. Yeah. So entity resolution is essentially a way of algorithmically detecting where two things are the same real world thing. So you can think of it very simply as, if you find Alex Ridden in a database and you have a completely different, completely separate system that mentions Alex Ridden, how do you know that they're the same person? This becomes much trickier when you have more common names, right? The names that can very easily potentially be belonging to someone else. So we start to think about, okay, as humans, we're making this decision every day, right? When we read a news article and it mentions somebody, we often kind of think about whether this other article is referring to the same person. Now, with famous people, that's pretty easy. If I'm reading about maybe Elon Musk, I kind of know who that person is. If I'm reading about, we can pick someone else. Maybe if I'm reading about someone who's less famous, I might be a bit less sure the first time that I read about them. But if I'm finding them in the same context later, I'm probably starting to pick up on the fact that they are the same person. When it comes to data that we collect, we can think of like evidence that we use to decide whether they're the same. So do they have the same date of birth? Do they have the same passport ID? These are pretty concrete factors. But then you can have things that change, like your home address. You can move, but also other people can live at the same place. So you get these pieces of evidence that all allude to the fact that we're talking about the same person, or it could in fact be just the same business. But whatever it is in your data that you need to know, I want to join them together. I want to kind of complete the profile around these things. I need to figure out what I can do to merge those data sources and do that confidently and algorithmically, and usually at scale.
Yeah. So once upon a time, I worked in the world of kind of KYC, customer onboarding, client lifecycle management, this kind of thing. And it sounds to me very much like what you're describing, that we would used to shoot for to support straight through processing would be a 2+2, right? 2 identifying pieces of data from 2 separate places to validate. So the super common ones were, name, address, name, date of birth from an electoral roll and, I don't know, telephone registry or something like this, bring them together and say, yeah, we're pretty confident that this is the same person. But maybe you could speak to some of the, I guess, other and more pressing use cases that, where is this really important?
So what we've discovered, I think, over time is that any time that you're doing any analytics, getting this right is really critical. So back to that point I was making about when I was building models for all different types of reasons, I was realizing that my model's performance was much better driven by my data preparation than necessarily by my ability to model the data later or build models on the data later. I think in the financial crime space, one particularly interesting application, or there's a number of them, but in anti-money laundering, you have a lot of obfuscation through businesses where being able to follow the money is kind of essential to being able to detect, obviously, passages and movements, and ultimately to analyse whether that money is coming from illicit places or going to illicit places.
Yep.
And one of the really interesting problems with AML is that we get lots of layering and spoofing of companies. But this problem's kind of exaggerated even more if you can't even connect the dots where two companies are the same. So we've seen some really interesting cases where it's actually difficult to connect the transactions around a given account. This is typically when a bank might be monitoring money, say, moving out into an external account, and where there might be ambiguity about what that account holder or who that account holder is. So in particular, we think of unique identifiers like your account number and your IBAN, but it might be that many times they have multiple different accounts under the same, let's say, client profile at a bank. So you have to use some of the softer information as well, like the name of the account holders, the address that's registered, but also, who else are they transacting with? Are these transactions belonging to like a community of commonly owned accounts? When it comes to entity resolution, this gets quite a juicy topic because you have to think to yourself, are you trying to detect where two accounts are the same? Okay, maybe we can use IBAN, but I think generally what we're trying to do is figure out if all of these other accounts belong to the same real world person or are under the control of the same real world people. And then you have to start to think about much more complex ways of determining that. I
mean, surely you just check Companies House now.
Yeah. Companies House is always filled with the most validated and high quality data.
Absolutely. But no, I think you there's something almost implicit in what you say there that I think is really, really important. When you were talking about understanding whether or not these accounts are linked and the I guess soft identifiers, which is a nice way of putting it, and that's something that you mentioned already, and that's context, right? I think all financial crime investigation is making a judgment based on data, expertise, and precedent. So where the data can be woolly, for want of a better word, it's all of that context around it that informs the decision that's ultimately going to be made, right? So when we think about financial crime investigations and pulling together what we know, what we think, what we maybe don't know quite so well, but might be able to infer, we're pulling data from a wide variety of sources, right? So we're thinking about the data that we have in-house, whether or not it's been as wonderfully prepared as maybe it would have been done by yourself once upon a time, as well as third-party or open sources as well, which are maybe slightly less structured. So does that change the way that you approach investigations, where you have structured, unstructured, what the inferences might be? What are the sort of implications of bringing together two data types or two or more data types, structured or unstructured?
Hey, so that's a really great question, because I think that's where I think innovation was needed. So when we think of unstructured data, there's a couple of different types. There's the type which you can immediately maybe connect with your client, and that's the type where maybe they've submitted something. So if they've submitted like documentation, then we're just actually really talking about extracting and structuring, or sometimes validating the information that's in that document. And I think there's a lot of automation uplift there, right? But what I'm specifically talking about is where we don't know if the unstructured data is referring to our client. So that could be because it's a blog post or information scraped from the web or news articles. And if we go back to that example I gave earlier, if we find Alex Ridden in the news, it's extremely unlikely, and I hope not possible, that you would find my date of birth, my registered address, my phone number, and all of the things that actually we relied on very heavily to perform entity resolution internally. So the question then becomes like, okay, well, how can we actually start confidently saying that two people are the same if we don't have those more reliable, concrete identifiers? And I think that's where you need systems which acknowledge that the information we're learning is not to be trusted immediately.
Mm-hmm.
And the most important, or one of the most important things, is to also expect a high degree of variance. So if you're thinking about, okay, we might detect something quite concrete, like my role at Night Analytics. That's like a kind of fact that we could learn about me if we found an article about it. Or it could also be a fact about you in an article, and it could even be an older article referring to a place that you used to work. So these are pieces of information that are great to use to be able to do entity resolution. But one of the challenges is,
how do we trust it?
How do we trust it? And also, how varied are those mentions later? For example, did the company undergo a renaming, or is the company that they're working for got like a common short name? Or did they, there's like variance involved, and this gets even bigger when we think about the softer or the weakest pieces of evidence, which could be, for example, I'm associated with entity resolution, and it's a relatively small community of people that work in the space compared to some of the bigger topic areas. But it could be useful evidence that two people are the same if they work in these niche areas, right? So then you start to think about, okay, is this an attribute of a person, that they are sharing opinions or specialized or writing blogs in this area of expertise? And if so, how is entity resolution mentioned elsewhere? Is it talked about like record linkage or data disambiguation, or there's like many different ways that you can talk about the same subject. So if you want to use these links to this type of data that comes from unstructured and less trusted sources, you also have to tackle the disambiguation of the related information as well.
Yeah. Well, we've just gone down levels. Yeah, absolutely. So I guess there's a phrase that sprung to my mind that I guess has been thrown around sort of in the digital asset crypto space. Let's leave that conversation well alone for the time being, but it is this concept of trust but verify, right?
Yeah.
And so to the point that you were just making there about how do we disambiguate, for want of a better word, is that a verb? Disambiguate. The thing that I'm thinking about is the credibility of the sources, right? So how do we, for instance, your example, how do we validate that, yes, the person that we think we're looking for is this person who sounds vaguely credible, but in an era of rampant misinformation online, for instance, how do we validate that is even a good indicator of the trustworthiness of our information?
Yeah, no, totally. So I think that's also maybe a good distinction. The area that I focus on is, can we trust that we found the same thing? I think the area you're describing is, can we trust what we learned was true? And I have definitely got a bunch of opinions on that, but I think what I would think about is how many sources are sharing the same piece of information. It's not always a great kind of measure, but also, are those sources proven to be true in other contexts too?
Which is bizarre, but if you think about the way that, for instance, search engine optimization and the way that Google ranks credibility of sources, it's a similar kind of approach, right?
Yeah, definitely. And I think if you can actually aggregate data, the reason I mentioned earlier that we focus on matching kind of things, and most of them are real world things like, you know, people or products or companies. We actually find it increasingly more important to be able to recognize more abstract things that are the same. So an example would be when a big news event comes out, you might have hundreds of articles about exactly the same moment in time or event that happened. You actually need a form of entity resolution to bundle those things together and say, okay, we've got 100 articles. They're all talking about this thing that happened. It could be a company takeover, or it could be a big lawsuit, whatever it might be. I think that also helps validate that event was being talked about on like a global scale across all of these different articles, and all of them came out with a very similar or concrete fact about an event that took place.
Yeah, so that's something that, you know, another use case that of course I think lends itself well is sort of that of adverse media or negative news, right? Particularly in the context of a financial crime investigation, and then, you know, absolutely you've got the sort of John Smith problem, right? Is this my John Smith? But then for a financial institution, you've also got the, okay, so is this my John Smith, and is this relevant or pertinent negative news to financial crime? A former colleague of mine always used to give the example of, let's say, a former French prime minister who often fell out with the French agricultural community, shall we say, which is not uncommon. But then you would, you know, search in an adverse media provider or a screening tool or something like this, and you get this information back. But that is completely irrelevant to bribery or insider trading or double dealing for that individual, for instance. So I guess pulling this together, and again, I suppose that's less to your specific kind of interest, but I wonder if maybe you just speak for a minute or two on that kind of adverse media use case, and then maybe let's throw in transliteration just for the hell of it as well.
Yeah. No, that's a good one. So when, like you rightly said, I specialize less in figuring out if the news said something negative about somebody, and more about making sure that all the news about them is connected.
Yeah.
But I think a key part of that is, of course, like understanding what the real world is in this soup of like amazing amounts of information that come out every day. So one of the ways that what we do kind of helps in the adverse media screening is we create a lot of structure which allows for kind of much easier filtering. So I was mentioning earlier that you know, even entity resolution goes by many names. That I can think off the top of my head of about 20 different ways that people might refer to that same subject.
Right.
That's the same with what you're describing. So if we're thinking about, you know, involvement in a crime, usually you might want to have some understanding of what those crimes are indeed, so you can decide whether that's a risk that you're worried about or not. And when you extract information from unstructured sources, of course, it comes in many different forms. If you just think about, let's say, different types of financial crimes, there's many ways to describe what is ultimately like embezzlement. And there's many ways to describe fraud. And all of those different mentions actually kind of need their own way of disambiguating, so that you can then easily decide these are the types of articles that I care about for my business. And I would say that entity resolution plays a role even there. In the context of the work that I've been doing, I think I was looking at mentions of crimes around like drug trafficking and different forms of everything from like petty theft through to like very serious, large scale organized crime rings being busted. I think again, it just comes back to you can either search that information, but then you have to be able to search it at scale all the time. Or you can kind of semi-structure it so that you can pull back what you're interested in first and then maybe do a second deeper dive on the actual content.
So this I think is scalability, obviously, is the watchword, right? If you're a bank or financial institution with hundreds of thousands, millions, tens of millions of customers, and you are continuously needing to make decisions. Do I want to continue to do business with this customer? Do I need to tell somebody about this customer? Does this customer present significant risk to my business? It's difficult to do that at scale if you haven't had an Alex Ridden in-house tidying the data up. But maybe you could just speak, a little bit to the nature of messy or fragmented data, and whether or not there are sort of entity resolution techniques where the data is maybe not quite so clean as if you've had the opportunity to curate it.
Yeah, no, there are definitely. I think also internally, by the way. So if we just think about the structured data sources that most companies will have databases filled with all kinds of information inside them, there's usually some that have had a high degree of, like, let's call it maintenance. Mm-hmm. So people have spent real time and effort entering the data, validating its completeness and accuracy and freshness. Have they checked these details in a long time? But equally, you'll often find these other sources of information which have become quite almost corrupted over time. Mm-hmm. And the classic will be, it depends on how that data was collected in the first place. So were people incentivized to lazily maybe put default values in place? Mm-hmm. And are they now skewing or affecting your ability to be confident about the details associated with your clients, and indeed affects how well you can maybe match that information across those client profiles? Mm. The other area we see quite a lot is if there's no check during the initial onboarding against your existing databases, or if you have multiple product lines in your business and you're onboarding clients in all different places, mm-hmm. There's just different standards and qualities of data capture at that stage. So it's very easy sometimes for the same client to be onboarded twice. And in fact, more often than that, they could be onboarded multiple times across your different business lines. And then you come to a point where you're trying to actually reconcile all of that information together because you actually want to know about them holistically. Yeah. And that's the most common problem that we come across to help solve.
So that's super interesting, because not only then are you thinking, and this is something that I've worked on historically as well, you're not just thinking about this now from a perspective of a financial crime risk perspective, but also, and crucially, there are a lot of organizations that, as you say, have multiple product lines, and they're across and upsell opportunities there as well, right? Those clients. But if you've not got a clear picture of who they are and what service they're taking from you, then you could be missing opportunities there.
No, totally.
And by that, and sort of by, I guess, coming back to the human weakness in the loop, shall we say, right? At that point, people just popping in default values or, misentering data. And this could be within the institution as well as the client themselves, right? Be they human or a legal entity. If you think about inorganic growth, M&A as well, and you're now trying to bolt together databases across different customers, from two entirely different businesses, maybe across geographies, continents, so on and so forth. I imagine that represents, again, another material risk of cross-pollination, cross-infection. You tell me.
No, indeed, I think that's true, right? Because in a lot of entity resolution systems, we kind of snowball what we know about a client as we merge them. And that can help us match to more information, but it can also inadvertently, accidentally kind of pollute the profile. Really simple things like spelling mistakes or indeed default values. These are all things that people have been handling for a very long time. But I do think that it gets very interesting when we also think about inheriting relationships across different sources. So something we're quite often asked about is, and I think you were speaking about it earlier, is like ultimate beneficiaries, or when we think about entity resolution on businesses, we often think about this legal entity, right? This thing that has a legal status and identifiers. But when we think about crime, we're actually much more interested in who controls all of this, and what is the hierarchical relationship also of the companies and the child companies. We need to know that information in order to actually make a whole assessment of the whole business. And a big part of that is that parts of that information might be kept in different places, right? We might know that a person has been a UBO of a company, but we also might then find out that that company has ownership over a majority of a different company. And these structures become increasingly complex. So you don't only want to merge information about that single entity, you're actually looking at connecting the dots across quite a large and complex structure.
Well, and we can go further than that as well, right? If we look at the propensity for, let's say, even sanctioned individuals in recent times to effectively offload control of those to their nearest and dearest, for instance, spouses, children, otherwise. Yeah. And that's another place where, I suppose you're looking to infer a huge amount of data from maybe something as simple as a last name or former address, I guess. There's actually a couple of really, interesting examples of oligarchs, others who have done exactly that, and then basically found themselves being sanctioned by virtue of their kid having a very active social media presence, shall we say, showing off yachts and party lifestyles and all this good stuff. But there's something that I wanted to come back to, which is, as you say, that ability to replicate rubbish, i.e., are we reinforcing mistakes when we are training models on initially bad data, right? So firstly, we need to ensure that the data is good, and then we need to connect it together, particularly if we're thinking about network analytics, graph analytics. I was wondering if maybe you could speak to that a little bit. How do we actually connect that data, and why? And then maybe we'll talk a little bit about why that's value to a financial crime investigator.
Yeah, sure. So I think that there's two big aspects that I see networks being super effective when it comes to both detection models and facilitating ultimately investigations. There's the transaction network itself. So being able to actually see where money moves, how it moves, both the kind of temporal aspect, so how often and how frequently and how soon, but also obviously big volumes. And the shapes of those networks can be very important in a lot of financial crime detection models. I would say the other aspect is the one that you were touching on, which was that social network side. So what's happening in the real world around those transactions. And both of those signals are important both to the models and also to the investigator. I think the investigator typically will be looking much more at that surrounding social network, and the models are typically acting more on that pattern recognition. But when I think about actually the examples you were sharing, I recently also was looking at, it's a very old investigation, and I think it was like based in Italy. We were looking just at the data as it came out of the company's house, so ownership of companies. and then linking that to the news. So can you just see where companies would pop up, and if they were mentioned in the news, how that kind of built a real context in a graph sense. And what you could start to see is that there was a company, or actually a large group of companies, that all had lots of shared owners, and those owners kind of almost formed like a social network. And at some point they became published in the news around some negative events. Let's say they kind of ended up being found out to be fraudulent, and it was quite widely publicized that it was a big scheme that involved like large amounts of money laundering. And immediately what you see is that the active participant just kind of stops, obviously. Yeah. But interestingly, a lot of the co-founders, the other people who were beneficial owners and had control over the previous companies, but who weren't mentioned explicitly in the news articles, started to form much more and many more companies. And eventually, if you look at this on a timeline, those companies also were found to be also doing bad things. And it was like a cycle of as soon as somebody was getting heat, they would kind of go offline. But by looking at the social network itself, you could actually almost predict who was going to start taking control of the operation and continue it ultimately.
So, I mean, firstly, that's fascinating. And when we stop recording, I'm going to ask you more about that. But I guess the thing that you touched on there is where, you know, the models are really, really good at looking for patterns, really big numbers. And then the human is really good at, again, using their judgment. Does this feel right? That sort of sense of intuition, and bringing them together is the best way to kind of see the bigger picture, I suppose. So eager to kind of get your perspective, given that you do work with machine learning and artificial intelligence. Like, what's your perspective on, you know, how much of this is automatable and how much is geared towards that sort of human in the loop, particularly as we think of, you know, the closer we get to AGM or AGI, forgive me, do we ever think that AI is going to be able to have that sense of intuition, for instance? Like, where do you fall on this?
Oh, that's a really juicy question. So I guess, you know, strictly, I would hope that we're also thinking about human intelligence is also quite structured. I do believe in intuition, but I also very much, having kind of worked alongside investigators and trying to show them the information they need and trying to bring to them things that they deem to be interesting. I know that there's a fine line between understanding a modus operandi and looking for all of the signals of that in data. And I think the human element is, we're very good at search and discovery, right? We can really, like you said, kind of notice something that we recognize is similar to a pattern that we understand, right? Humans aren't understanding the pattern because they have a set of rules, but they fundamentally understand how a mechanism is operating and how people are performing fraudulent or financial crime activities. And I think that's why they're very good at investigating, because indeed it might feel like intuition, but it's rooted in real and deep knowledge of crime. I think when it comes to like algorithms at the moment, I would say I believe we've got this really challenging point in time between explainability. Like we owe it to everybody to be structured in what we're detecting, right? And we don't want to just say that somebody's doing something bad because it feels like it. We really should be driving that, because we're picking up on real signals that are rooted in evidence and rooted in like knowledge. So at the moment, I would say I see AI today being a huge facilitator to investigators. I think it can reduce the time spent on doing the mundane side of retrieving information. I think it can help surface things that might be hard for a human, especially when there's a huge, vast amount of data. I think AI is just fantastic at being able to process that at scale and pick up on things that we're interested in, and make more so now, right? Because we have AI that's very good at semantic understanding. So being able to process those things I was talking about earlier, like news or signals, or being able to actually detect where something interesting might have occurred. I think when it comes to the way that we build models that look at, say, network analytics, it's still, I think, the balance between trying to essentially codify how we detect a modus operandi that we understand. I think that's still what we're doing for the most part. I think that there are elements of anomaly detection that really step into, we don't really understand it, we just know that it's different to the way that most people operate. But for me, it probably will always be a combination. It might also be because a lot of what's happening is not digitized. So machines can pick up on signals that are in your data, whereas humans can also like look for things that might not be.
Yeah. The proverbial tell.
Yeah, exactly.
But that's, I think that's, I would completely agree, by the way, that broadly we should, we can use technology to, and I'm going to use my favorite word, minimize the quotidian things that need to get done on a day-to-day basis, so that we can focus our attention and looking for the tell where it is most productive, most valuable, right? But then what about when it goes pear-shaped? What happens when the network breaks down, the chain breaks down, we can't go any further with our investigation, right? You read investigative journalists, and similarly, they need to verify, validate, they need to evidence everything that they're doing, otherwise they're going to get slammed with libel, right? So what happens when we get to that point where the network has broken? Is the story gone? Are we relying more on inference there? What happens?
I think I struggle to answer that, actually, but I think my intuition also goes to thinking about perpetual monitoring. So one of the really challenging things in the past was, obviously we would periodically review or assess certain things, and so we'd wait until that review came around, and then bad news if it happened 9 months ago, good news if it was yesterday.
Yeah.
But now, obviously, we've got much better at being able to continuously listen for signals, and I think AI has played a huge role in the ability for us to do that as well. So if it was the case that everything under the sun, all the data, ultimately led to like a cold trail, I don't think that the case is lost. I think it's, in fact, now more than ever, we're able to continuously check for new signals that relate to that case. And I think, really interestingly, the play between the social network side and the signals that come from, maybe news or unstructured data, publicly available data sources, as well as any signals you might have been missed because, I don't know, you didn't have the right detection techniques, or you didn't think of something in the past and you now want to apply it. I think both of those things can lead to reopening or bringing new information to what you might have thought of as a closed investigation.
Yes. And as you went through that, I thought I really mustn't sound too opportunistic here, but it kind of is precisely why we work together, right? It's bringing together context that we have in networks, be they transactional or social, for want of a better word, right? It's making very, very complex data sets accessible and explainable to humans. And it's providing providing a robust framework by which these teams can access, interrogate, and ultimately make decisions on this data. So yeah, I mean, I'm conscious that we're sort of hitting time now. So I just wanted to say thanks so much indeed for joining me today. And if I could ask you to leave us with, one piece of advice for a chief compliance officer, a chief risk officer who is looking to improve how they integrate diverse data sets, and importantly, how they can trust them other than buying Knights Analytics, what would that be?
I guess my main message is really that we all understand that your ability to detect things is only as good as the data that you can bring it. So it should be top of mind. I'm sure it is for many people. And I would say that's why entity resolution is a critical part of any detection system. I'll leave it at that. But thank you also, Luke, for all your questions, and it's been a really nice conversation. So
I've really enjoyed it. It's definitely been an education for me, and I hope it's been an education for you all as well. See you next time. Cheers.
Bye.